Welcome back to the Secular Homeschool Revolution. This podcast is for secular progressive homeschoolers who are reimagining education in a very unapologetic way for their kids. I am your host, Ashley, and I think if we're all here, we have decided that the system wasn't built for our kids, and so we did something about it. And I love that we're building community together. So today's topic is, what does it mean to be educated in 2026? I want you to think about the last time someone, whether it was a relative, a neighbor, a stranger, maybe at the grocery store, asked whether your kids were getting a proper education because they were homeschooled. What feelings did you have? Were you defensive? Were you upset? Do you have an elevator pitch in your pocket ready to respond? Or do you feel like when those questions are asked that you feel like a little bit of doubt, or you feel like you're even questioning yourself in your decision? Because I feel like that question in itself, like, are your kids getting a proper education? I feel like that assumes that everyone agrees on what education actually is. And in 2026, we absolutely do not agree. So today, we're going to pull apart the assumptions and we're going to ask, what does it mean? Because this is not, 1965. We're not doing industrial era schoolhouse type education. And we are in a world that our kids are actually going to live in. And the traditional education system hasn't done that much evolving for 2026 world. And even that term, I don't feel like the term educated has evolved to 2026 either. And so let's talk about it. Let's flesh it out. So let's talk about the old definition and why it's broken, because, we do have to know history to understand it and see its evolution and how it impacts us today. And we've talked about it on the show before. The modern school system in America was shaped in the late 1800s, around the early 1900s, to produce compliant factory workers and obedient citizens. That was the plan. I know that sounds kind of like conspiracy theory type, but that is just history. And Horace Mann, he modeled early American schools on Prussian military education. Again, that is not conspiracy, that is fact. The goal was to have people being punctual and have uniformity and follow instructions without questioning them. And for that economy and that world, it worked. Was it great? No, but it worked for their plan. And so most of the 20th century, quote unquote, educated meant you sat in rows, you memorized what the teacher said, you passed a standardized test that mimicked what the teacher said just to make sure you understood and memorized the text. You got a diploma, then you got a job. And that was it. And then there was a time when that deal, got you into middle class, like a basic high school diploma would get you into middle class. And that economy is gone. The jobs that rewarded being, compliant and you memorized all the things, that made you automated. And the diploma, heck, a degree doesn't even guarantee you employment or into the middle class. And the U.S. has over 44 million people with student loan debt and a massive inflation problem with people who have received and worked hard to earn a bachelor's degree. And again, that whole contract and system is broken. And yet, we still use the definition of what Horace Mann thought of educated as the standard. And we're trying to measure kids against a rubric for a world that no longer exists. Can they sit still? Can they memorize? Can they pass standardized tests? And if they can't, or if they learn differently, those kids are behind, or we call them struggling, or we call them a problem. And I mean, how many of you guys have pulled your kids out of school partly because they were the problem? I see you, and I think this episode is for you, or at least will give you some feeling of relief or affirmation or confidence. So let's kind of okay. So I want to clarify. I'm not saying academic skills do not matter, because reading, writing, mathematics, critical thinking, scientific reasoning, I believe those are foundational. But the question is, are those skills the ceiling of what we mean by being educated? Or are they the floor? Because research backs this up and says that they are the floor. And we've been treating the floor like it's the whole building. And we got to do better. So let's start with understanding being educated is not the same thing as being good at school. Some kids are really good at the performance of school. They know how to sit there quietly. They know not to be disruptive. They know how to turn in an assignment. They know how to memorize the information long enough to pass the test. And yes, those skills are useful. I'm not saying structure, deadlines, or academic skills do not matter. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that they're not the forefront of things. But being good at school is not the same thing as being educated, because a kid can get straight A's and still not know how to ask good questions, or even know that there's questions that should be asked. They can test well, but they may not know how to think critically. They can read every assigned book and still not know how to recognize bias. And they can follow every rule and still not know who they are. Okay? And all of that does matter, especially for progressive homeschoolers, because many of us are not just trying to recreate school at home. We are trying to raise kids who can think, who can question, who can create, who can connect, and who can participate in a world with compassion and courage. And they know how to see who's not included in this story, who's not included in that perspective and in that worldview. So no, education cannot only be about producing kids who look successful on paper, because that is such a small bird's eye view of who they are or who they can be. And I want to look at some information that came from the World Economic Forum's Future of Jobs research. Now, I know, they are a little controversial. But their skills data is based on surveying thousands of employers across different industries, and they do show a consistent pattern year after year. What it says is the top skills that they say the workforce needs are not content knowledge. You know what they need? They need analytical thinking, creative thinking, the ability to be resilient and flexible, and have being able to be self-motivating and self-awareness, and to be a lifelong learner. There's nothing that mentions needs to know the periodic table or how to show their work for long division problems, okay? And the next thing I want y'all to listen or learn about and research on your own is Dr. Daniel Willingham. He does extensive research on how the brain learns. And one of his core findings is that knowledge is not transferable in isolation. You cannot just learn facts. You have to learn how to think with those facts, which means you are doing content and then application and then deep practice. So it's a pattern, right? Context, not content, context, application, and deep practice. And that's what education should be building. And, I feel like to do that, it does take some time and patience and mentorship and individualization. And I do think that's what a 30 kid classroom structure is terrible at providing. I mean, does it happen? Sure, but it doesn't happen as often as it needs to. It's just impossible. And this isn't a, blow to the teacher in the classroom. It's just the way the system is set up. And we have to acknowledge that the system is working exactly how it's designed to. Another concept I'd like for you guys to research is epistemic autonomy. Harvey Siegel is a philosopher behind the idea, and it means an educated person isn't just someone who has been given the correct beliefs. It's someone who knows how to form beliefs, who can evaluate evidence, recognize bad reasoning, change their mind when the facts change. And in a world of AI-generated misinformation and the algorithm, epistemic autonomy might be the single most important thing we can give our kids. And you cannot teach it by telling your kids what to think. You can only teach it by letting them practice thinking. Who knew we needed to allow our kids to practice to think? So I guess So if I was to synthesize the research into a working definition, for me, it would sound like an educated person in 2026 is someone who can read and communicate effectively, who can reason quantitatively and scientifically, who's developed a sense of self-direction and intrinsic motivation and can navigate complexity and can handle change, and who is not intimidated or afraid to learn new things, including things that they don't yet know exist, and have a strong understanding of ethical responsibilities. I feel like that's a much bigger, richer definition than they can pass a test or they can score, so and so high on a test. And I think that's a lot closer of a definition of what being educated in 2026 is. And I think we're all, I guess, in this community are working towards in our, unapologetic education that we are offering our kids. So what I want you to be able to do with this information in this episode is to be able to walk through and build your own definition of what it is to be educated in 2026. I want you to be confident in your definition. I want it to be built with intentionality, and I want it to be defensible and genuinely just tailored to your kid and your family's values. So I created an exercise. Let's walk through it together. So I'm calling it, and you may call it something else, but the Portrait of an Educated Person exercise. And you don't need any special curriculum. You just need a journal and maybe a thought partner, maybe someone you're homeschooling with or someone from your community. Now, I want you to, what we're going to do first is look backward. Think of someone in your life, whether they're real or historical, and write their name down. And this person needs to be your definition of what you believe is truly educated, right? Not just credentialed, but truly educated. So what do they have? What can they do? How do they handle problems and people and new information? Write this down. Because what I'm asking you to do is basically look at your own implicit definition so that you understand that you've been consciously aware of it this whole time. Okay, part 2. Now look forward. Imagine your kid at 30 years old. I know that's a lot to ask. And I don't want you to think about what career you hope that they have or they say that they're going to have. I want you to imagine who they are. How do they spend, a Saturday morning? How do they handle crisis? What kind of friend are they? What conversations can they hold? What do they reach for when life gets hard? Write that down because that is going to be your destination. That's where we want them to land. Okay, now the third part. Look at the gap between the person you admire and the person you're raising. What skills and habits and dispositions and knowledge does that gap contain? Okay, so that right there is your curriculum. That's what you're building out. And, it's not an easy scope and, sequence if you're a former teacher. This is yours. This is what you're building into, right? Now I want you to name something that might come up. Some of you are going to do this exercise and feel like this gap is enormous or that you're inadequate or like, how am I supposed to produce this person? I'm just, a homeschool parent. And the truth is, if they were in a traditional institution into the system, they wouldn't produce that person either. The most educated people most of us know were not educated by school, but they were educated by mentors, by failure, the ebbs and flow of life. Like they had an obsessive interest or they they traveled the world. They read books. They kept books in their hand. They had interesting conversations that kept them up at night. They journaled, School in itself is just the container. But you've already, freed your kid from the system, from the container. So now you're building the actual education. And again, that's part of the revolution. That is part of you as a parent doing a radical act in support of your kid. And that's something to think about and to be proud of. Okay, so I do want to bring this back on what educated means being historically and culturally literate, because we cannot call a kid educated if they only know one version of history. And if their education only centers whiteness or colonization or patriarchy or capitalism and the people who had the power to write the textbooks, then we have not given them a full education. Point blank, period. We've given them a very filtered one, like a Snapchat filtered one, like overly exaggerated. We beautified it. It's all, we've blurred all the blemishes, and that is a huge disservice to society. An educated kid should know that history is not just about the dates and dead presidents. History is people. It is resistance. It is survival. It is understanding erasure happens. It's culture. It's policy. It's land. It's labor. It's migration. It's art. It's language. It's food. It's music. It's protest. And they should know about Indigenous histories beyond Thanksgiving. They should know Black history beyond slavery and Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. They should know Latin history is beyond food and festivals. And queer history does not only pop up during Pride. And women's history irks me. And I was still on my break for Women's History Month, but I might bring it back. I should, because women's history is not just during that month, but we don't need to only explore the first woman to do so-and-so or such and such. And we don't talk enough about disability history, only when it's like an inspirational story, but it's far longer than that and far more important. And also, we can't treat cultural literacy as something that is like extra. It should always be included in the main meal, the full course. And that's why progressive homeschooling matters. We have the opportunity to tell fuller stories, and we can connect Shakespeare and Kendrick. We can connect math to justice. We can connect science to environmental racism, and we can connect literature to identity, belonging, and power. And that in itself is not political indoctrination, but I, if I'm going to get flowery, I feel like that is education with the lights on. Another part of being educated that does not get included in the conversation or doesn't get enough attention is, can our kids live in community with other people? Because you can absolutely know how to do algebra, but do you know how to apologize? Can you write all the essays in the world? Yes, but do you know how to listen? And like, can you handle conflict without dehumanizing someone? And I know some people are going to want to disconnect this from, that's not school, that's parenting. And if you're on this journey, you fully understand that parenting and education go hand in hand, or you should by now. And those things are just connected. And education is not just academics. It is also how our kids learn to be human. Do they respect boundaries? Do they respect consent? Can they repair harm? Can they name their feelings? Can they disagree without being cruel? And that's important, especially in this day and age of social media where you can be a keyboard, bully, warrior, and that's why there's all this internet bullying, because kids are just cruel, and we have to give them better tools. And can they recognize when they cause harm, even if that was not their intention? These are all skills. This is education. And we exist in the adult world, and we know lots of adults who were not taught these skills. And at their big age, it's their responsibility to learn these skills. And if they don't, it's our big age to hold them accountable and say, hey, you don't know how to apologize. Or that should have been handled different, or you were absolutely wrong, or that crossed consent. Because it is reckless to exist in this world and cause that type of harm and not be aware of yourself. And we are not, and not that we're not, but we are trying to raise kids who do not have to spend their entire adulthood unlearning emotional avoidance, or to be people pleasers, or to be defensive and not how to take feedback, or just be silent. We want them to go into adulthood and have those skills. Adulthood. What is wrong with me? Now, I think we can't have this conversation without talking about what it means to be able to navigate technology and AI. Because in 2026, pretending AI is not a part of education is just not realistic. Our kids are growing up with tools that can write for them, that can summarize for them, that can generate images on demand. It can make study plans, it can solve problems, it can think for them, and it can, confidently give wrong information. And so being educated now means our kids need digital literacy. And again, that's another piece of what it means to be educated in 2026 that has evolved versus from the Industrial Revolution version, right? And I get that AI is harmful for the environment, and I'm struggling with AI personally because I'm doing the research and I see the data centers are harmful, and I've tried to turn off AI as much as possible on my phone and on my computer. And even for my job, AI is implemented in the software. So we just can't escape it. I know for my husband's work and some of the different contracts, they have, AI built into their systems, whatever, their softwares. So it is hard to escape it. And even with our social media use, because AI is built into our, social media platforms, when we're searching and we're on there for so much, that's impacted by the data center. So it's an ethical issue, and we know it's impacting Black and brown communities because that's where they're putting the data centers. So yeah, but it's still a part of the conversation. And it's important for our kids to understand to not let AI do everything for them, and that they need real digital discernment. Discernment in my house has been the word, I feel like, the last year, like especially with my teen, like practicing discernment. But they need to understand that AI is not a replacement for your brain, and it cannot build your values. And the information that it's summarizing comes with a bias. And it can't disagree with you, so it can still confidently be wrong. And our kids need to learn how to use technology with ethics. They need to know how to fact check, how to protect their privacy, how algorithms shape what they see, how misinformation spreads, how tech can be used to organize, create, and connect, but also cause a great deal of harm. And that is part of being educated now. And a kid who can use technology without being used by technology, that is a powerful skill. That is what we need to be a part of their education. Educated means having a sense of self. This is my last segment for this episode on what it means to be educated in 2026, but I think it's important to address because I do think traditional education often misses that piece of a kid having a sense of self. An educated kid should know themselves. I'm not saying that it has to be perfect because they are still growing and evolving, and we are still growing and evolving, and we evolve as we get older. But education should help kids understand, what do I care about? What am I good at? What is hard for me? How do I learn best? What kind of support do I need? What kind of person am I becoming? What kind of person do I want to be? Am I taking the steps to get there? Because a kid can graduate with honors and still have no idea how to make a decision that aligns with them or their values. And that is a slippery slope. And they can be college ready, but still not be life ready. And I think that's extremely important to recognize, especially here in the homeschooling world. I don't know. I feel like I see a lot of hand-holding in the homeschooling world. And I get it. They're all our precious babies. We love them. We want them to be safe. We want them to be happy and healthy and all of the things. But we do a lot of hand-holding in the homeschooling world until they're like young adulthood. And I'm not sure how much space that allows our kids to have to test the waters, to understand that they can learn from mistakes if we're constantly holding their hand. So we do need to slow down and check our programs and notice our kids, because the kids need movement. The kids need quiet. The kids need to learn through art. They need to learn how to talk things out. They need to build it, touch it, see it, act it out, and connect it to real life. And when kids understand how they learn, they begin to trust themselves. And that in itself is education as well. And I know I said the last segment was my last one, but no, I was going to edit this one out, but I changed my mind. Being educated means caring about the world. And I think this is where my progressive homeschool heart lives, because I don't want my kids just to be smart. I want them to care. I want them to notice injustice. I want them to know that people are not disposable. I want them to understand that freedom is connected. I want them to see that their choices affect other people. And that doesn't mean carrying the weight of the world as kids, because we don't want to make our kids anxious. little activists who feel responsible for fixing everything. That's not what I'm saying, but we are trying to raise kids with awareness. And that means looking at it from the lens of kids who understand community and they understand how mutual aid works, and that it is not charity, and that history is happening, that they're living it, they're a part of it, and they understand that silence can protect systems, and that kindness without justice is not enough. And to me, again, this is my opinion. You are welcome to have your own, but an educated kid is not just asking, how do I succeed? They're also asking, how do we take care of each other? And that's a big difference. So what does this really look like in homeschooling? Because I know these conversations can feel and sound really big and really philosophical, but in real life, we still have kids who literally ask for snacks every 12 minutes. So what does that look like? It looks like reading a book and asking whose perspective is missing. It can look like doing math and you have your manipulatives, right? Because your kids can see the concept and not just memorize the formula. Like they're seeing how things work. And it can look like comparing a historical speech to like a hip hop verse and talking about identity, resistance, and language. And it can look like watching a documentary. Me and my family love it. Oh, it drives my husband crazy. So we like to watch a documentary, and then we'll pause it 11 times, and then we'll do fact checking. And we're like, oh my gosh, this is true. Or, oh, hey, this is a little bit not what happened according to these other resources. But also me and my girls really love fact checking too. Like not fact checking. We like what is it? Spoiler alert. It's like, oh my gosh, in any movie, and that's off topic, but I love a good spoiler. Anyway, so yeah, we stop personally in my family and we fact check documentaries, and also, teaching our kids how to email and plan their week and budget and, make a meal, care for a garden, or even just apologizing. I think those are all included in education. And again, this isn't going to be neat, and it's not going to be measurable, and it's definitely not going to be cute for your Instagram photo ops, but it is real. It is a real part of education. So if, to close us out of this episode, if I had to define what educated in 2026 would mean, I would say an educated person is not someone who knows everything, but they are a person who can think critically, and they, learn continuously, and they understand history honestly, and they know how to navigate technology ethically. They can live in a community. They know who they are and their values, and they care about the world around them. And that is the definition me and my family are holding on to. And I feel that way because our kids do deserve more than a compliance-based education. They deserve an education that prepares them to be whole people who are curious and compassionate and creative and critical and just community-minded people. So as we move through 2026, I want us to release some of that fear that our kids are behind, or they're not doing enough, or that our homeschooling does not look like the traditional school system. Because sometimes the most meaningful education happens in the conversations and the questions and the projects, not with you directly, but within the community and the books. And most importantly for me, I think it's the mistakes and what can they learn from that, the growth and discomfort and how to repair. And I feel like in those moments, that's when our kids begin to understand themselves and the world more deeply. And that is work, and it counts. And that's part of the revolution. So thank you for listening to the Secular Homeschool Revolution podcast. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with another homeschooling parent, somebody who's on the fence, or someone who's trying to define education beyond grades and tests, or who's just overall scared to dive in. And don't forget to like, follow, subscribe where you listen. It helps other homeschool progressive families find the space. And if you haven't, please rate and review. And until next time, keep questioning, keep reimagining, keep building an education your kids do not have to recover from, and do it in the most unapologetic way.